In fact, Isaac, there's nothing to add, but simply to say that at one point, when Fidel was asked the question, I think it was what's his name? The leader of Angola, NATO. I think NATO made the point that Fidel understood the geography better than he did of Angola. And at one point, Fidel said the sweetest victory, the sweetest struggle in the world for him was the struggle in Southern Africa. When he put the entire Cuban society at risk by sending the elite Cuban force, somebody asked, and his response was, "This is the sweetest victory in history for him. He has to fight against the apartheid regime because how much he hated racism and how much he hated the apartheid system."
No, what Cuba did was absolutely incredible, right? Okay, and the commitment it made, right? And at one point, and the point is, the Cuban, you can go and there's been numerous documentaries made, right? I recommend, there's actually a documentary made, a 22-minute one called Cuba and Africa by Negash Ibrahim. It's a very good documentary to watch, and I think it's excellent. But the Cubans have produced a 22-episode like epopeia de Angola, the epic of Angola, right? They produced numerous memoirs about this and so forth, and so it's really drives home the point about this connection with Africa, right, and the need to repay this debt. When the Ebola epidemic was raging, right, in West Africa, Cuba, the U.S. was going to send military, right? That's what they want to send, soldiers, right? Cuba sent doctors, right? And at the UN Security Council, when Cuba had been elected to one of those non-permanent positions, right? And people know, you have your 5 permanent members, and then there's another 10 who are elected, if I remember correctly, on and off, and Cuba was elected, okay? He said, humanity owes, the Cuban representative said humanity owes Africa a debt, right? So this is valorization of Africa. That's really incredible, right? In terms, and of course, within all of this, it's like when we talk about Africa, it's not only that, it's, you have people being trained from African countries in Cuba. So one of the things I should mention is that part and parcel of the South African War of Terror, is a whole series of terrorist acts. And one of the most famous or infamous is the May 4th, 1978 attack against Cikiah against a Namibian refugee camp, right? Hundreds of people were killed. These were mostly elderly, women and children. The South Africans also kidnapped people as well. And a lot of these people, some of the children who survived, who were orphaned, were taken to the Isla de la Juventud, the Isle of Youth, where they received education, right? And you can find so many diplomats in Southern Africa, right, who will talk about that it was in Cuba that they received their training, right? And I remember there was an ambassador from Namibia, right, who had been one of these Cikiah children, right, and talked about this and so on. So Cuba's contribution has been immense. But also within that as well, you have people from the Black Panther Party, from the Black Liberation Movement in the United States, who received refuge in Cuba, the most famous being Assata Shakur, who has received refuge in Cuba, despite all the price that has been placed on the head and the attempt to try and force and cajole the Cuban government to hand over. They've said, no, this is not negotiable, right? So there's a whole series. Robert Williams, right, from Deacons for Self-Defense, right, who introduced this idea in the U.S. South of fighting back against the racist terror of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. He spent some time in Cuba as well. So there's a whole history of Cuba. Stokely Carmichael, for example, right? Okay, spoke and went to Cuba. And in fact, at one point, Stokely Carmichael, if I remember correctly, and you can correct me, Cikiah, said the blackest man in the Caribbean is Fidel Castro, right?
That's right. That's so correct.
All of these things. And then when Fidel retired, right? When Fidel, basically with his illness, and he stepped down formally in 2008, February of 2008, there was a magazine called the Pan-African. I don't know if you remember that magazine, Cikiah. It's not long, but it was the largest circulation African magazine. They did a special edition on Fidel Castro, Africa's friend, right? And the point, which is very interesting here, is people remember that when Mandela died in 2013, outpouring took place, right? And at the funeral, all manner of leaders attended, right? But there were 6 leaders. You had the UN Secretary General, obviously you had the President of South Africa at the time, but 6 foreign leaders were given space to speak. One was Obama, but the person who closed them out was Raul Castro. And when Raul Castro was introduced, because he was then now president of Cuba, he was introduced as the president of the country that helped to liberate us.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the blockade. Let's go back to some of the economic aspects. So we know the U.S. blockade affects not just the economic relations between Cuba and the U.S., but the economic relations that Cuba has with every country in the world. So how does the U.S. blockade on Cuba affect Cuba's relations with African countries and its economic relations specifically?
Well, it's the consequence of it is quite severe. I was quite pleased recently to see where the South African foreign minister have actually floated the idea, an idea that we have had and we have tossed around as well, that the Global South must take the initiative to defy the United States in putting Cuba on the list of international terrorist states, because they know that's not the case. And she's making the point quite vividly that the Global South need to take some initiative and to defy the United States. And I think the world is generally moving in that direction, where more and more people decided that the Americans have no right to get engaged in that level of strangulation and to destroy the country simply because of ideological reason. And I think, Isaac, you already made the point that perhaps one of the two most important things in world history is the history of the Cuban Revolution and the history of the Asian Revolution. So obviously the Americans and the rest of the imperialist forces, as much as they want, will try to destroy it. I also think there's another dimension to this, and that's something we perhaps should try to tap into. And that is, I think, section of the American farming community, for example, are losing out significantly in the restriction of the embargo and not being able to sell Cuba product that will enhance their own economic livelihood. So I think as people who are engaged in a campaign to force the Americans to lift the embargo, I think we need to begin to put some focus on that part of the population that wants to see the embargo end, want to see the Americans stop this level of cruelty. And the same thing goes for Canada. So how we tap into that is part of the task ahead for us.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So what about let's talk more about the program of action then, and breaking this blockade. So what further partnerships are being proposed between Cuba and African countries that have been set out in this program of action?
So, I mean, one thing is the program of action is quite long, right? Okay. And one of the advantages is that, you can have, unlike here in North America, where we have civil society organizations in motion, you have a lot of governments who basically, at least in terms of the rhetoric, talk about building this, right? Okay. And one of the important points about this conference, where there were so many people from the state level who were there. As Cikiah has already mentioned, the South African Foreign Minister, Nalindi Pandor, she gave a wonderful presentation. That's almost an incredibly passionate CV of Cuba's role in Africa. It was incredibly powerful, right? And so what they propose in increasing trade, right? Increasing investment, increasing incorporation, right? Okay. And so on. What that means is to be worked out, right? And so the next solidarity meeting of Cuba and Africa Solidarity meeting, the eighth one, is 2 years from now. And it's going to take place in Maputo, Mozambique. And people are saying, well, that's where we are going to sit back, right? Okay. And we see if we've actually transferred words into deeds, right? Okay. Rhetoric into action, right? And so on, right? So one of the key things, and it was raised, is this thing is running the blockade, defying it, acting as if the blockade doesn't exist, right? Now, yes, the United States is, the dominant power in the world, militarily and economically, the strongest one. That power, in a sense, is eroding, right? Okay. Of course, no one can predict how the future will unfold, but we see a shift in economics, right? In terms of the locus of economic power in the world, right? And so people are realizing that as new economic configurations are emerging, right? This gives an opportunity, right? Okay. But also there's this idea that Cuba has given so much to Africa, and the Cubans don't ask for anything. I mean, the Cubans are very humble, right? They always like to say that they intervened. One of the important points about Angola, when they intervened in Angola, they gained nothing from it, okay? no diamonds, nothing, right? Came back from that, right? And so the father, Michael Lapsey, who was an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, right? And actually ended up being blown up, losing his arms through one of the apartheid era terror attacks, right? That tried to eliminate people. He said, no country has given so much to the world and received so little in return, right? So there's also this moral thing on Africa, right? Okay, in the sense. So one of the things perhaps that's quite clear is that, Cuba, in providing its doctors, right? Okay. In South Africa, perhaps can pay for those doctors, provide more money, right? Is also combating the kind of propaganda, right, that's launched against Cuba from the United States. But it's also developing these kind of relationships. One of the points we talked about in Cikiah, and I have spoken about quite regularly, is Angola produces oil. Okay, Angola would not be an independent state. It would be an extension of South Africa in one way or the other, a client state, a protectorate, right? In a sense, apartheid would still be going on now, for all we know, right? If they had not suffered that military debacle in Angola. So, in a sense, why don't they provide oil to Cuba, right? And so forth, since Cuba gave them so much. And Cuba continues to train. I mean, you have students coming from these countries that receive training, education, right? Okay, become doctors, become engineers, what have you, right? At extremely little cost. Sometimes the entire education is covered, right? So there's this idea that Africa is going to look into deeper economic relations with Cuba, deeper investment and commercial ties with Cuba as a way of directly challenging the economic blockade. We know the diplomatic support for Cuba is powerful. Every year when the United Nations votes against the resolution condemning the U.S. economic war against Cuba, the commercial, financial, and economic embargo, African nations stand up almost in one after the other, right? Valorizing Cuba, talking about what Cuba's accomplished, right? It's to transform that diplomatic victory or diplomatic contribution to Cuba into these concrete economic actions, right? And so so we had people representing high-level governments, right? High-level governing parties and so forth. And there was this pledge that they're going to look into concretizing this into real economic links with Cuba. And Cuba needs it, as we know.
Yeah. And the program of action, it speaks a lot about technological co-development between African countries and Cuba. And one thing that they mentioned multiple times is telemedicine. Do either of you have any insight on how telemedicine would work in this context? And I'm sure it's already a service that's being provided in some countries. I'm just guessing, but do you know anything about that?
No, I'm not familiar with how that process, how it's going to work, or what they're proposing.
Yeah, I only know very little about it, and it'll probably be in a sense that Cuba has all this information. Okay.
Yes.
And in terms of certain situations, you can have through, we do Zoom, we do so many different virtual platforms, ways of connecting. That information can be shared, right? And it can involve, perhaps, somebody can, work in multiple places at the same time, right? And there can perhaps be some economic benefit for Cuba, because it's important to understand that while tourism is such a significant part of the Cuban economy, Cuba's medical internationalism, right? Okay, is a significant component of the Cuban economy as well, right?
Yeah.